Hi, I'm Elizabeth, this is the Bookish North. Welcome to Sagalong 2022, which is apparently the only thing that will get me out of hiding in front of a camera, which is fine. I'm here now, and for this year we are reading Egil Saga, and today we are discussing the first 22 chapters, which in my edition I think is about 40 pages, so very short chapters. And I think the first thing to address in this part that we have read is that at this point Egil himself, that the saga is named after, is not even born yet, which may seem like an odd pacing for us modern day readers, but it makes sense in the context. I would also say that I feel like this is actually, as far as sagas go, this is fairly quick-paced. I mean, we do get the genealogies and mention of relatives that we tend to do in sagas, but there's less of it here than in many other sagas, and I feel like we move fairly quickly into the action and into storytelling. And I feel like it's a very it's a more structured and more compact kind of storytelling than you find in many other sagas. I don't feel like we jump around as much as in others, so I enjoy that about this. So here we first meet a man called Kveldulv, which translates to evening wolf, and his two sons, Torolf, the oldest, and Grim, the youngest. These two brothers are described to be very different from each other. The oldest, Torolf, takes after his mother's side of the family. He's described as being light-haired, being beautiful, strong and big and athletic. He's capable, he goes out being a Viking, he comes home with a lot of booty and having made himself rich. And he's also described as having a kind of a pleasant demeanor. People like being around him. In contrast to this, his brother Grim is described as being ugly, and he's dark-haired. He is described as having a broad neck. He's still big and muscular, and he's still capable, although his capabilities is described having more to do with being an administrator of the estates, because this is a family. Kveldulv is a local chieftain, and so they have they have lots of land to look after. And Grim is described as the one being at home and overseeing this and doing hunting and fishing and this kinds of stuff. He is said to be more like his father, and he's also described as being sort of the grumpy, frowning type and not so easy to be around as his older brother. So his older brother is the popular guy, and he is the one that is basically the main character of the part of the saga that we now have been reading. We hear about how he comes home from being a Viking, and then he goes off to be part of the court, sort of around the Norwegian king Harald the Fair-Haired, or Harald Hårfagre, as he's called in Norwegian. And he is an important figure in Norwegian history. I'll get back to that, but we hear about how Torolf is becoming part of the group surrounding the king. He and the king becomes friendly, and he is doing well in this area. Torolf is gaining a lot of new wealth. He's helping the king, he's fighting for the king, and he does really well for himself, and he's been given lots of boons from the king. He gets inheritance that shouldn't actually perhaps have come to him, but because he's a likable guy, people say that when I die I want him to have my things and my wife, which is another thing that could be discussed, I guess. But yeah, he is doing really well for himself, and probably a bit too well, because eventually this relationship he has with the king sours, and this has much to do with two brothers that are bad-mouthing him to the king because they have an inheritance dispute with him. But the king chooses to believe them over Torolf himself, which is hurtful to Thorolf. You can actually see that he is not enjoying this, and it ends up with the king killing Thorolf, and it's sort of reading between the lines that the king is sort of jealous of the status and the popularity of Thorolf, and he is considering him to be a possible rival to his project. And so that is basically where this section ends. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about this time in Norwegian history, because Harald Hårfagre, or Harold the Fair-Haired, is one of those really famous kings in Norwegian history. And his legacy, the thing that is usually said about him, is that he was the one who collected Norway into one realm. Historians will tell you it's not quite as simple as that, but that's his legacy. And the battle at Hafrsfjord that was described in this section, I mean, good luck to my English-speaking friends pronouncing that name. This battle at Hafrsfjord is one of those pivotal moments in Norwegian history, because that is when Norway's history as a nation starts officially. Because before this time, Norway didn't exist. We had a lot of smaller kingdoms which all had their separate kings. And we hear the short version in this first section of Egil Saga about how Harold conquered one by one of these smaller nations, and then creating a big kingdom for himself. And the Battle of Hafrsfjord is where the last pieces of this puzzle come together, where he conquers the last two remaining smaller kingdoms that he didn't control. And then he becomes the king of Norway entire. Well, not Norway as it is today, but as it was then. And I would say Harold doesn't really come out of it really well in this story. In the version of him that is portrayed in Egil Saga, he comes off as being somewhat of a tyrant and quite petty and jealous, I would say. Whereas if you read the saga that is written about him by Snorri Sturlason, that you can find in the Norwegian King Sagas, or Heimskringla, you will get a much more positive portrayal of him. And it's interesting to read and contrast these two. The story of him in his own saga is also much more detailed than in this. And it's also his saga also contains one of those, fierce Viking women that tends to show up in the background of the sagas, because Harold meets and falls for this woman called Gyda, and he asks her to marry him, and she refuses him for not being important enough, for just being the king of this small, unimportant kingdom. And she says, once you're king of all of Norway, I will consider marrying you. And that's the beginning of his project. And he also, as is described here, he also vows to not cut or comb his hair until the project is done, which is how he gains his name. And then, he does finish the project, and he does get to marry Gyda. But that's another story, which is not part of this. This is also, another side note here, but the story of King Harold in Heimskringla is written by Snorri Sturlason. We know that. Whereas the Icelandic sagas, like Egil Saga that we are reading now, have unknown authors. We don't know who wrote them. But there is a quite strong belief in many people. There's a theory that has many advocates that Snorri Sturlason is actually also the author of Egil Saga, because he is related to the people in the saga, and he lived in Borg, which will become the family seat in Iceland of this family at some point. And another thing is that he's also in some way can identify with some of the characters in the saga. So that's used as arguments for him being the author of this, as well as the writing style and the clear literary style of writing here. Whereas the main thing that is used as an argument against this theory is the differences in the portrayal of King Harold in the one saga that we know is written by Snorri Sturlason, and the portrayal of him in this one. So yeah, I think that's interesting too, though a side note to this saga. But yeah, so that's one of the reasons I really enjoy reading this, is the sort of insight into Norwegian history and about how life was in Norway at this time. I know we will be moving to Iceland shortly, and that's going to be interesting too. So far, I'd say, I mean, even if we haven't met Egil yet in this saga, we have been introduced to events that will have a big impact in his life, and we have witnessed the start of a feud with the kings of Norway, which will be important going forward. And we have also seen this relationship between the brothers Torolf and Grim, which will later on be mirrored in the relationship that Egil has to his own brother, which is also called Torolf. So that's something that will be good to have in mind going forward. We haven't really gotten to know his grandfather and father very well, because this saga so far has focused so much on his uncle Torolf, but we will also get to know them a bit more. And yeah, Skallagrim, which is what he will be known as, because as at a very young age he's going bold, and Skalla means bold. It still does in contemporary Norwegian, actually. So yeah, the bold Grim, his father, we will get to know more going forward. Yeah, I think that's about all I have to say for today. It's not too much, because we're at the very beginning of the story and we haven't been introduced to the main character yet. And I look forward to reading the rest and getting on with discussions. I also look forward to listening to what my co-hosts have to say about this. So until next week, bye.